Jack Coleman's mornings always started before the sun came up. By 5:45, the city outside his small Seattle apartment was still half asleep, its windows reflecting rain that never seemed to stop. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and laundry detergent. Jack moved quietly around the kitchen, packing a small lunch while Ella, his 7-year-old daughter, sat at the table coloring a paper dinosaur. He checked the clock again, the numbers glowing softly. 6:15 a.m. He smiled and told her they had 5 more minutes before the bus. She grinned, her front tooth missing, and asked if he'd be home in time to read their favorite story. He promised he would, even though both of them knew. Promises like that didn't always hold when overtime called. Jack was a plumber. Not the kind who owned a company, just the kind who fixed leaky faucets and busted pipes for long hours and little pay. After his wife passed away, bills had piled up like rainwater against a blocked drain. Still, every paycheck went first to Ella's school shoes, then to rent, and only lastly to himself. The apartment was small, the furniture secondhand, but it was theirs. What he lacked in comfort, he made up for in love, and he carried that love like armor against exhaustion. That morning, as he checked the mail slot, an envelope caught his eye. Heavy paper, sealed with a gold crest. Definitely not meant for apartment 2B. The name printed in graceful ink read, Victoria Hollister, Penthouse Suite. He was about to slip it back into the outgoing mail when Ella's voice floated over. "It's so fancy. Daddy, can we open it?" He laughed softly and told her they shouldn't, but her wonder tugged at him. Later that afternoon, instead of dropping it at the front office, he decided to deliver it in person. The Hollister estate was a world apart. Marble steps, glass chandeliers, and cars that cost more than his yearly income. Jack felt out of place in his work jacket, while Ella's wide eyes took in every shimmer of light. Guests in designer gowns swept past, barely noticing them. When they found the hostess, a woman in an elegant navy gown seated in a sleek wheelchair, Jack almost turned to leave. But Charlotte Hollister greeted them with a polite, curious smile that reached her eyes in a way that felt human, not rehearsed. Ella handed her the envelope, but in the exchange, her small handmade bracelet beads strung unevenly on pink thread slipped into Charlotte's lap. Charlotte tried to return it, but they were already walking away through the rain. She looked down at the bracelet, a small heart charm glinting in the light mani, and, for the first time in a long while, her composed mask faltered. Somewhere behind the clouds, fate stirred quietly, as if amused by the tiny mix-up that had just rewritten 3 lives. The next morning, Jack showed up at the Hollister mansion again, envelope in hand, rain clinging to his jacket. The guard at the gate eyed him skeptically before letting him through. Inside, the house felt even larger than he remembered, full of soft light, polished wood, and quiet footsteps. He asked to see Charlotte Hollister, hoping to simply return the invitation and disappear before anyone noticed he didn't belong there. When Charlotte appeared in the hallway, elegant and composed, she studied him with polite confusion before assuming he was there for a plumbing issue. The butler had mentioned a leak in the kitchen, and, with his tool belt still hanging from his waist, he looked the part. Jack tried to explain, but when he followed her gaze and saw a small puddle forming under the sink, he couldn't help but smile at the irony. He rolled up his sleeves and said he might as well take a look. Charlotte watched from her chair as he knelt by the sink, his hands steady, movements practiced. It had been years since anyone had entered her home without an agenda. His voice filled the quiet space as he joked lightly about the stubborn pipes in old houses. She laughed, surprised by the sound of it, and told him she hadn't heard her own laugh in far too long. When he glanced back, their eyes met, and for a fleeting second, the difference between their worlds didn't seem to matter. She asked About his daughter? The one who dropped the bracelet. Jack's voice softened as he spoke of Ella, of bedtime stories and scraped knees, of how she'd saved him from his own grief after losing his wife. Charlotte listened without interruption, her fingers tracing the edge of the bracelet that now rested in her lap. She confessed that she once loved photography but gave it up after the accident, saying it was hard to hold a camera when her hands shook. He told her that sometimes the world breaks things just to see if they can still shine. She smiled faintly, the compliment catching her off guard. As the repair came to an end, the atmosphere between them had changed. The air felt warmer, the silence less awkward. Charlotte asked if he and Ella would consider attending the upcoming charity gala. She said it was only fair since he had saved her kitchen from a small disaster. Jack hesitated, explaining that fancy events weren't his world. He wasn't the kind of man who fit in with people wearing $1,000 suits. Charlotte met his eyes with quiet determination and said it wasn't about fitting in. It was about showing up. That night, as Jack tucked Ella into bed, she begged him to go. She wanted to see the lady in the wheelchair again, the one who smiled kindly and kept her bracelet safe. Jack tried to explain that it wasn't for people like them, but Ella's grin and the thought of Charlotte's sincerity made his resistance falter. When he finally said they'd go, Ella threw her arms around his neck, squealing in delight. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the wet streets. Jack leaned against the window, thinking about the day, about the woman who lived in that grand house, yet seemed lonelier than anyone he'd ever met. Somewhere deep down, he knew he was already being pulled into something far bigger than he understood. The invitation lay on the counter beside Ella's crayons. No longer a mistake, but the beginning of something that felt almost like fate. The night of the charity gala arrived with rain glittering against the city lights. The Hollister Grand Hotel shimmered like something out of another world, its glass doors opening to chandeliers and marble floors that reflected every soft footstep. Jack stood awkwardly in the lobby, tugging at the collar of the only suit he owned, one that didn't quite fit around his shoulders. Ella clutched his hand, her eyes wide at the sight of guests in glittering gowns and polished shoes. She whispered that everyone looked like they belonged in a fairy tale. Jack smiled softly and said they were just visiting. They moved through the crowd, and the whispers began almost immediately. A man in a cheap suit, a little girl in a dress clearly bought from a regular department store. Curious eyes followed them, polite smiles hiding judgment. A woman murmured something about the help wandering in the wrong direction. Jack tried to ignore it, holding Ella's hand tighter as she pointed at the ice sculpture shaped like a swan. He told her quietly not to touch anything, aware of how out of place they were. Then the room shifted. The soft hum of conversation changed as Charlotte entered, wheeled gracefully across the polished floor in a deep emerald gown that caught the light like 1,000 small stars. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had fought hard to claim her space in the world. Her eyes found Jack and Ella immediately. Without hesitation, she moved toward them, the sound of her wheels cutting through the murmurs. Charlotte greeted them warmly, her tone gentle but commanding. The crowd's whispers softened, then stopped. She knelt her chair slightly toward Ella, complimenting her bracelet and the new ribbon in her hair. The sincerity in her voice silenced anyone who might have mocked them. When she introduced Jack as her friend, a ripple of surprise moved through the room. But none were more shocked than Victoria Hollister, who watched from across the ballroom, her sharp gaze fixed on the man standing beside her daughter. Later that evening, as the gala ended and the guests began to leave, Victoria summoned Charlotte to a private lounge. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension. Victoria asked who the man was and why he had been sitting at her table. Charlotte's tone was calm but firm. She explained that Jack had helped her, that he was kind, that Ella was a remarkable child. Victoria's expression didn't soften. She warned that kindness often hides motive, that people who have little might see her daughter's world as a chance to take much. Charlotte's hands tightened on the armrest of her chair, her voice steady, as she told her mother that Jack wasn't like that. But even as she said it, she saw the look in Victoria's eyes, the one that meant the discussion was far from over. The next day, Victoria's assistant received quiet instructions. A background check. Everything on Jack Coleman, discreet but thorough. She wanted facts, not feelings. Meanwhile, life for Jack and Charlotte began to bloom in small, tender ways. They met for coffee after her physical therapy sessions, where she teased him about always drinking black coffee as if it proved something. They walked through the botanical gardens, Ella darting ahead to collect leaves while Charlotte and Jack talked about everything and nothing. He showed her how to fix a loose faucet handle herself, and she introduced him to classic black and white movies that reminded her of hope. Charlotte found herself laughing again, unguarded, the sound surprising her every time. Jack noticed how she would pause before telling stories about her past, as if testing whether he would see pity in her eyes. He never did. Instead, he looked at her like she was just herself, whole and capable. She told him one evening, under soft rainlight, that she had stopped believing she could be loved after the accident. He told her quietly that maybe love wasn't something you had to earn, just something you had to stop running from. While they built their quiet connection, Victoria sat in her office surrounded by city lights and shadows. A folder lay open before her, full of neatly typed reports. Jack Coleman, 34, widowed plumber, 2 months behind on rent, limited savings, medical bills from his late wife's illness, 1 dependent child, reliable work record, no criminal background, but struggling. Her nails tapped the desk slowly. To her, it wasn't a love story forming between her daughter and this man. It was a threat. Victoria closed the folder and looked out the window where rain streaked the glass like silver threads. Her reflection stared back, sharp and controlled. She whispered that she would handle it herself. The storm she was about to unleash would not be one of weather, but of will. And it would test every fragile piece of the bond her daughter had begun to build with the man from the wrong world. The morning started cold and gray, with fog clinging to the edges of the construction site. Jack was tightening a valve on a water line when he noticed the black car pulling up near the fence. It didn't belong to anyone from the crew. The engine idled for a moment before the door opened, and Victoria Hollister stepped out, dressed sharply as if the mud and noise of the site couldn't touch her. Her heels clicked against the gravel, steady and precise, the sound cutting through the hum of machinery. Jack wiped his hands on a rag and walked toward her, already knowing this wasn't going to be a friendly visit. She greeted him with a calm smile that didn't reach her eyes. She said she appreciated how kind he had been to her daughter the Nomo. Pro. Without ceremony, she pulled an envelope from her bag and handed it to him. He opened it out of instinct. Inside was a check, $100,000 written in careful, slanted ink. Her voice remained smooth as she explained that it was compensation for ending his friendship with Charlotte, for stepping out of her life quietly and permanently. For a long moment, Jack said nothing. The wind carried the sound of a crane moving steel overhead, a rhythm that filled the silence. He folded the check neatly, placed it back into the envelope, and returned it to her. His voice was calm but firm when he said that love and integrity weren't things a person could buy. Victoria's jaw tightened, the faintest flicker of irritation behind her perfect composure. She told him softly that he was making a mistake and that she didn't like mistakes. Then she turned and walked back to the car without looking over her shoulder. The fallout began almost immediately. 2 days later, His supervisor called him into the office. The conversation was brief. Budget cuts, they said. Nothing personal. By the end of the day, his security badge no longer worked. His phone buzzed with missed calls from his landlord. Letters about overdue bills and unpaid utilities piled up on the kitchen counter. When he tried to apply for other jobs, none of the companies returned his calls. Then came the knock on the door. 2 agents from Child Protective Services stood in the hallway. Polite, but wary. Someone had reported that his apartment was unsafe for a child. They glanced around, took notes, and left with stiff smiles that didn't hide the suspicion in their eyes. Jack sat on the couch afterward, hands trembling, knowing exactly who had done this. But he said nothing. He couldn't let Charlotte know what her mother had done. It would only hurt her more. That night, after Ella fell asleep, Jack sat in the dim light of the kitchen. The eviction notice lay on the table beside the unopened bills. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft sound of rain tapping against the window. He rubbed his eyes, exhausted, wondering how quickly a life could fall apart when someone with power decided you didn't deserve to keep it. Yet even in that silence, there was something unbroken in him. He had lost work, money, maybe even security, but not his sense of right and wrong. And that, he promised himself, no one could take away. Ella had always believed her father could fix anything. Broken toys, leaky faucets, scraped knees. He had a way of making things whole again. But over the past few weeks, she had seen something in him she couldn't fix. He smiled when she looked at him, but his eyes told another story. The long hours he spent staring at the kitchen table, the quiet sighs when he thought she was asleep, the unopened letters piling up near the sink. One night she heard him whisper her mother's name, his voice cracked and small. That was when Ella decided she had to do something. The next morning, the clock read 7:15 a.m. when she pulled on her pink jacket and slipped a note under the salt shaker that said she was going to help Daddy. She tucked one of her handmade bracelets into her pocket, the kind she made from leftover thread, and carefully folded a letter she had once found in a drawer. It was a letter her dad had written years ago to her mom, promising that no matter how bad things got, he would always take care of their daughter. Ella folded it twice and held it tight. The bus driver almost didn't let her on, but her confidence and a handful of change convinced him. By the time she reached the Hollister headquarters, her small shoes were wet from the puddles outside. The building rose above her like a mountain of glass and steel. Inside, the marble lobby gleamed, and every sound she made echoed off the walls. The guards at the desk exchanged confused glances when she announced she needed to see the boss. One of them knelt down and asked why. She said she wanted to talk to the lady who broke her daddy's heart. Word spread quickly, and soon Victoria Hollister herself appeared, composed and elegant, more curious than angry. Ella stood in front of her, hands trembling slightly but eyes full of determination. She told her that her dad was the best man in the world. That, when there wasn't enough food, he gave her his dinner and pretended he wasn't hungry. That he fixed things for people not just because it was his job, but because he hated seeing anything broken. She said he loved someone named Charlotte, but that lady's mom didn't like him. And now her dad was sad all the time. Victoria listened, her sharp poise softening with each word. The room grew still, even the sound of the elevator fading. Ella pulled the small bracelet from her pocket and held it out. She said it meant hope, and that maybe Victoria needed some. When Victoria reached out to take it, the thread brushed her palm. She froze for a second, recognizing the uneven beads. The small heart charm? It was identical to the bracelet Charlotte had shown her months earlier. The one she said came from a little girl named Ella. Something cracked inside the woman who had built walls out of control and fear. Her fingers closed around the bracelet and the letter that Ella placed beside it. The handwriting was Jack's, strong and steady even in grief. She didn't read it right away. She just stood there, holding the two pieces of their lives in her hands. Ella smiled shyly and told her that sometimes grown-ups forget that good people can be poor too. When the guards escorted Ella safely back to the bus stop, Victoria stayed behind, silent. The bracelet was still warm in her hand. She whispered that maybe she had been wrong about everything. And for the first time in years, tears slipped quietly down her face. By the time the clock in Victoria's office read 7:30 p.m., the city outside had turned gold and violet with the fading light. She sat behind her desk, the bracelet Ella had given her resting in her palm. The letter from Jack lay open beside it. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about numbers or reputation. She was thinking about how a child had seen through the armor she had built and shown her what she had become. When she finally called her assistant and asked to have both Jack and Charlotte come in that evening, her voice was steady, but her heart raced. Jack arrived first. His shoulders were tight, his jaw set, ready for another battle he didn't want to fight. Charlotte came in moments later, worry etched across her face. The air felt thick with unfinished conversations. Victoria stood slowly, moving around her desk with the bracelet still in her hand. She told them both to sit. Her voice was different, softer, as she began to speak. She confessed everything. The background checks, the bribe, the anonymous report that had brought Child Protective Services to Jack's door. Her tone broke when she said she had done it all out of fear. Fear of losing her daughter. Fear that she might again fail to protect someone she loved. She said she was wrong. Jack stared at the floor, his hands clasped tightly together. He didn't know what to say. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears, not out of anger, but relief that the truth was finally spoken aloud. Victoria continued, her composure wavering. She promised to withdraw every complaint, to call the agencies personally. She said she didn't expect forgiveness, but she wanted to make things right. Then she looked directly at Jack and told him she had read his records, his work history, the testimonials from his clients. She said the world needed more men like him. She offered him a position at the Hollister Foundation as Director of Housing Development, a real job, a leadership role, a chance to build again. Jack shook his head at first. He said he couldn't take charity, that he didn't want her pity. Charlotte reached for his hand and told him it wasn't pity. It was faith. Faith that good people should have the tools to do good work. Victoria nodded. For once, there was no pride in her eyes. Only humility. After a long silence, Jack finally agreed on one condition. A portion of his salary had to go directly to fund housing for single parents and struggling families. If he was going to accept her offer, it would have to help others like him. Victoria's voice cracked when she said yes. The weeks that followed carried a quiet kind of healing. The CPS case was closed. The eviction notice was withdrawn. Letters from the city arrived confirming his new title. Jack's former co-workers came by the shop to shake his hand, telling him they always knew he deserved better. Charlotte began joining him on site visits, watching him light up as he explained blueprints and community plans. Ella ran through half-finished hallways, laughing as the workers called her the boss's daughter. Then, one afternoon, Victoria visited one of the new housing developments. She saw families moving into clean, safe homes, children playing in yards that had once been vacant lots. Ella spotted her from across the field and sprinted toward her. She threw her arms around Victoria's waist and called her grandma without hesitation. The word caught Victoria by surprise. For a moment she couldn't speak. She just held the little girl close, her eyes burning with tears she didn't hide. When Jack and Charlotte walked over, the four of them stood together under the soft light of the setting sun. There were no grand speeches. just the kind of silence that comes when something broken finally feels whole again. For Victoria, it wasn't just forgiveness that filled the space. It was transformation, the kind that comes from letting love win over fear. And as Jack looked out over the homes he had helped build, he realized that justice wasn't about power or wealth. It was about doing what was right and finding the courage to believe that even the hardest hearts could change. 6 months later, the city looked different. The new row of community homes gleamed under the afternoon sun, each one painted in soft colors that felt alive. Jack stood in front of them, his hands dusty from a long day of work, pride glowing quietly in his chest. He had started at the Hollister Foundation with nothing more than determination and a promise to do right by others. Now, the projects he led were changing lives, not because of money, but because people trusted the man behind them. His co-workers called him a builder of second chances. He never corrected them, but in his heart, he knew the truth. It wasn't the houses he was rebuilding. It was himself. Charlotte often visited the sites, sometimes in her chair, sometimes walking short distances with a cane. She said she liked to see what hope looked like when it had a roof over it. The two of them had grown inseparable, their connection stronger than ever. Ella adored her, calling her mom without hesitation. Jack still remembered the first time she'd said it. Charlotte had gone quiet, her hand frozen mid-air before tears filled her eyes. Victoria had been there that day too, not as the powerful CEO she used to be, but as a grandmother learning to laugh again. Victoria had changed more than anyone. She spent her mornings volunteering at shelters and her evenings at Jack's kitchen table, rolling dough for pies with Ella. She didn't talk much about the past, but sometimes Jack caught her watching them, a soft smile on her face, as if still surprised that peace could feel so simple. For the first time in years, she looked free. That evening, Jack had planned something small. He chose the same restaurant where he and Charlotte had first met, back when a mistaken invitation had led to everything that followed. The waiter recognized them, and the lights around the patio flickered warmly as the sun sank into the horizon. Ella sat between them, swinging her feet, chattering about her day at school. Jack watched Charlotte laugh, her face glowing in the soft light. The moment felt quiet, complete. When dessert arrived, Jack stood and moved beside her chair. Charlotte looked up, puzzled at first, until she saw the nervous tremor in his hands. He knelt down, his voice steady but full of emotion. He told her that he never believed in fate until the day he showed up at the wrong house, holding an envelope that didn't belong to him. He said he wanted to spend every day proving that mistakes could become miracles. Then he opened a small velvet box, simple but beautiful, the reflection of candlelight dancing off the ring inside. Charlotte pressed her hand to her mouth, speechless. Ella gasped loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear before clapping her hands and shouting that they were getting married. Laughter rippled through the room as other diners joined in with applause. Charlotte reached out, tears shining in her eyes, and whispered, "Yes." Jack slipped the ring onto her finger and leaned in, forehead resting against hers, both of them smiling through the quiet that followed. Outside, the air was cool and gentle. The four of them stood together under the soft glow of the streetlights. Ella held both women's hands, swinging them back and forth, her laughter carrying into the night. Victoria reached over and squeezed Jack's shoulder, a small gesture that said everything words couldn't. Jack looked at them, the three people who had changed his life, and felt a peace he hadn't known since before his wife passed away. He whispered softly, half to himself, that sometimes the best things in life happen when you sit at the wrong table. Charlotte smiled, understanding instantly. As the lights reflected off the rain-wet streets, The family turned toward home, walking together in easy silence. The night held no grand music, no fanfare, only the quiet hum of contentment, the sound of love that had found its way back through forgiveness, courage, and the smallest accident that had ever changed everything.